The Martian Tales Trilogy by Edgar Rice Burroughs. The Martian Tales Trilogy is actually something that doesn't really exist. It's something that was simply created by the publisher. So Edgar Rice Burroughs wrote the John Carter Mars series, which is recently famous from the Disney movies, of course. The Disney movie. But it was a whole series of books in the 1910s. I think there were 11 books in total. There was never really a trilogy. What the publishers did here is they took the first 3 books, The Princess of Mars, The Gods of Mars, and The Warlord of Mars, and they just packaged the first 3 books as a trilogy. But they're not a trilogy. Like, the first 3 books don't have any kind of coherent story which merits them being packaged together. You could either read the first book, or you could read the whole series, or you could just read as much of the series as you wanted before you got sick of it. But there's no trilogy as such. That's just a marketing gimmick, which I fell for. I was in the bookstore and I saw like Martian Tales Trilogy, all in one volume, and I bought it. So Edgar Rice Burroughs, if you don't know, he was like a famous pulp fiction writer, the turn of the century, and this was when kind of pulp fiction was actually pulp fiction, right? Like it was actually named because they printed it on really pulpy, cheap paper. So he was writing back in like the heyday of pulp fiction. And he's most famous for writing Tarzan series, which everyone knows. But then the John Carter of Mars series was his second most famous series. The publisher's introduction to this Martian Tales trilogy is, in my opinion, a little bit pompous. They're trying to say that these are great kind of epic stories, and they're comparing it to classical mythology, like the Odyssey, the journey story. And I thought, that's a little bit of a cheap comparison. I mean, in my opinion, the themes of classical mythology are so broad. I mean, if you think about the Greek and Roman myths in total, they cover so many different types of stories and genres that you could really, if you wanted to, compare anything to classical mythology. I mean, any story that's out there now has some sort of parallel to classical mythology. So I thought this was just kind of a lazy way to try and force these stories into legitimacy. They're not good stories. They're pulp fiction. I mean, they're a lot of fun, don't get me wrong, but they're not, and they're classics in a sense, just because they've survived so long, because they've been in print for over 100 years now. But they're not any sort of like highbrow stories by any means. I had never read any of Edgar Rice Burroughs before, so this was my first exposure to him. It's a lot of fun. What's noticeable about these stories is it just goes from action scene to action scene to action scene. Like, he does not pause at all to give any sort of description, any sort of long description of what's going on. It's just, he briefly describes the setting and then boom, action. And in a lot of ways it's almost exhausting to read because you don't get time to catch your breath. On the other hand, that's kind of all part of the fun of it. I found myself that I couldn't read it for long periods of time just because it kept zipping from one action scene to the other. But in short bursts, it was a lot of fun. I attempted to kind of write a parody of what it was like. This isn't exactly what it was like. This is a little bit of a parody, but it's not too far off. So there I was, stuck on Mars. All of a sudden, all these green men attacked me. I fought bravely, and I had almost beaten them all, when all of a sudden a giant spider came out of the ground and attacked us. I battled the giant spider until these giant birds descended on us and tried to eat me, etc. I'm exaggerating a little bit here, but that's kind of very much the general tone of these stories. one action scene. Right when he's almost out of danger from one, he gets attacked by something else, and it just goes on breathlessly from there on. If you look at Wikipedia, these books apparently have a very kind of long legacy in the history of science fiction. They apparently created the whole sword and planet genre. You know, it's kind of like a fantasy kind of sword and sandal thing, but in outer space. Adam Strange from DC Comics was more or less based directly off of these books. Apparently even elements of Star Trek were based off of these books. I mean, Star Trek has like a lot of things that influenced it. But, you know, Captain Kirk kind of getting into fist fights on strange planets and romancing kind of green alien women was apparently influenced from this book. I think the Flash Gordon series was influenced by these books. I'm coming into these books a little bit too late. I was 28 when I first read them. The ideal age to read these books is 12. I think if you read them at 12, they would be the best thing ever. My brother tells me, actually, he had a classmate back in middle school who read these books when he was 12 and was obsessed with them and was always talking about how great they were. Yeah, if I had read these when I was 12, I probably would think they were the best thing ever as well. Yeah, from the perspective of an adult, from like a lot of old science fiction, there's a lot of fun to be had by just enjoying how cheesy the book is, you know, enjoying the cheesiness of some old science fiction for its own sake. By the second book, the plot does start to thicken a little, and I started to get more interested in the story, but by the third book, it just degenerates into one long chase scene. I'm not sure I'd recommend anyone kind of buy the trilogy like I did. But, you know, the first book is definitely worth checking out. If for no other reason, then this is you know, part of pulp culture history now. So The Princess of Mars, reading the first book is enough to give you a taste for it. You can continue on to the other books if you want to, but there's probably no need. I never actually did see the Disney movie version of this, but maybe one of these days I'll get around to that and review that as well.